The UK economy is having issues. The growth is still rather sluggish. Unemployment is increasing. Inflation, as we found out this morning, is still a stubborn problem. What's your diagnosis of the ills of the UK economy? What are the problems that continue to plague the UK economy at the moment?
Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up. Grab a cup of tea, maybe a biscuit, and perhaps something soft to shout into, because what you're about to see is nothing short of political theater at its most unsteady. Picture this. So spectacularly confused, it makes the art of juggling jelly on a trampoline in the middle of a storm look like child's play. Yes, we are talking about Rachel Reeves, standing before a committee of MPs, attempting to project the authority of a captain steering HMS Britain. Before we roll the full clip of this extraordinary display, a quick reminder. If you enjoy this kind of analysis, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, but it helps us bring you more unfiltered coverage of Britain's political stage. Right then, let's get back to it.
The key problem is productivity, and sort of investment is the answer. Investment in human capital, investment in physical capital, and also investment in new technologies. That's both public and private sector, but I think we've got the lowest private investment and lowest total investment as a share of GDP of any country in the G7. The result of that is that our productivity performance has not kept pace with our competitors and similar countries around the world, and that's why the fiscal rules that I've set out do treat investment spending different, because what you saw, and you saw this in the previous Parliament, and the plans that we inherited saw public investment as a share of GDP fall to 1.7% to GDP, and we're instead going to keep it at 2.5%, 2.5% of GDP. The easy thing to do as a Chancellor is to cut capital spending because, frankly, you're not likely to be the government that sees the benefit, the full benefit of that capital spending, but we're not going to keep making those short-sighted, wrong decisions, which is why we've set out those changes to the fiscal rules. But productivity, I regard as the key reason why our performance on government borrowing and debt, why our performance on GDP and our performance on inflation have all been not where we would want them to be. And my job as Chancellor is to turn that around.
Thank you very much. Lord Lonsborough.
Good afternoon, Chancellor. Can we zero in on what you describe as the key problem of the economy, which is the critical issue of low levels of productivity in the UK? And we continue to lag France, Germany, the US by very wide margins, about 12 to 20% in terms of output per hour. And we have done so for decades. Now, the UK's productivity in this first quarter has actually fallen by 0.2% compared to a year ago, and it's standing now at just 1% higher than it was 5 years ago. And it may well drop in Q2, given what's happening to GDP numbers. So my question is, how is the government seeking to address this productivity challenge? What specific policies will turn the dial, and when can we expect to see results?
Yeah, so there are sort of three things that affect, I guess, the productivity numbers. It's physical capital, labour supply, and that's the quality of the labour supply, so human capital as well as the numbers, and then total factor productivity, so technology. On capital, I'd say, sort of an assessment of the first year. I think on physical capital, that's where we've done most. In this first year, I've mentioned the £120 billion of extra CDEL capital spending by the government over the 5-year period, keeping capital spending by government flat as a share of GDP rather than it falling actually quite substantially, which was the plans that we inherited, but also using financial transactions through the National Wealth Fund and the British Business Bank and other public financial institutions to have additional capital spending, and then using things like the National Wealth Fund to leverage encouraging private investment, 3 times as much private investment, and actually that's a model we've used as well for Sizewell C, where the National Wealth Fund is the sort of debt underwriter for that project. And as I said to Lord Pettigas, we've managed to bring in £120 billion of private investment just in this first year of the Labour government. On labour supply, you would have seen, despite the increases in the unemployment rate, we've also seen an increase in the employment rate. And those two things can obviously be consistent, because what we've seen is a reduction in economic inactivity. And that's really positive, because we are still the only OECD country, I think, that's got a lower participation rate in the labour market than before the pandemic. And so reducing those economic inactivity numbers are absolutely crucial. The first step is that you move from being inactive to looking for work, and then hopefully you move into work. And there are still around 650, 700,000 vacancies in the economy. And, we want to better match the people that are available for work with the jobs that are available. And we want to help those people who are currently economically inactive, whether that's because they took early retirement and maybe now perhaps regretting that, and that is the experience of some people during the sort of COVID period, whether you are a parent who is struggling to balance work and childcare, or whether you're one of the growing number of people on sickness and disability benefits, where we know that there are many people who are desperate to work but are not given the support. We also, in the spending review, invested significantly in both apprenticeships and further education, because that has been the sort of Cinderella service of the education system this last decade and a half. It's great that we've got 50% of kids going to university, but the 50% who don't, which in my constituency in Leeds Western Pudsey, there'll be the majority of kids don't go to university. So investing in FE and apprenticeships is really crucial for this government and our wider objectives around opportunity. So we've done some of that spending review, but I certainly think that's an area where we can do more to address the productivity issue through improving labour supply and human capital. And then the last thing is around sort of technology, total factor productivity. And Andy Haldane, former chief economist at Bank of England, talks about this long tail of low productivity firms. And the DCIT secretary, Peter Kyle, he's sort of got 3 focuses in his area. First of all, it's attractive businesses that are at the technological frontier. Obviously, that is crucial for growth, and we're very good at that in Britain. We've got a lot of very high-skilled people. I was at Imperial College this morning. That's an area where we are good, but we shouldn't rest on our laurels. The second area is using technology better in delivering public services. That's this issue about not just how much we spend on public services, but about getting value for money. And then the third is the sort of point around that long tail of productivity, about better take-up of AI and technology by smaller businesses and less productive firms. And so we're working in all of those areas, and there is a big opportunity. The IMF and others say that if we integrate AI and technology, we could boost productivity by 1.5%. Over the next 10 years. So there's huge opportunities there. We've got to seize them, but we are very focused, as I hope you can tell, on that agenda.
And can I ask you about the fiscal impact of continuing low productivity, in that the OBR admits that its productivity forecasts are, to quote them, the most important yet uncertain forecast judgments they make. And they admit to the fact they've been successively too optimistic on productivity forecasts. And if current productivity trend forecasts that are assumed by the OBR of 1% growing to 1.2% over the forecast period to 2029 currently looks very optimistic, and certainly that's the Bank of England's view, what will be the fiscal consequences if productivity continues at the current low rates, which averaging about 0.2% per annum over the last 5 years?
Yeah, so the OBR forecast long-term productivity growth of 1.25% a year, and the Bank of England have a forecast of 1% a year. Both are very low by historic standards. Productivity over a long period of time is higher than that, but as you rightly say, the last decade and a half has been lower. So I guess you've got to decide whether you think that you should just look at a short period of time for what average productivity is, or long-term productivity, or whether you should look at a longer time series. And the OBR, as they've said, are looking at that at the moment. But perhaps I'll pass on to Steve to give a bit more detail.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the evidence David Miles gave, and I think he gave a sort of balanced assessment of where the OBR had come out, which is that they think that productivity has been depressed by a series of shocks over the last 15 years. But even abstracting from that, they're certainly not expecting productivity to return to the pre-financial crisis levels of 2.5%. But equally, you can veer into the too pessimistic, into the views that the recent numbers we've seen at 0.2 are likely to persist. And their view was that there were reasons both to expect that the sequence of shocks might not continue, but also that there is potential for future technologies, in particular AI as a potential new general purpose technology, to be a source of the innovation that you need in TFP growth that supports their forecast of productivity gradually picking back up to 1.25%. I think one of the elements I would add is to the list that the Chancellor gave of policy measures is the impact of the government's planning reforms to support productivity, which the OBR scored as increasing GDP within the 5-year forecast, which is also a very good example, I think, of coming to your first question, Lord Wood, of how is it possible to sort of increase productivity given the constraints of the fiscal position. I think those steps on planning are a really good example of how it is actually possible to do that.
My concern is probably more about the short term, in that the current forecast in the OBR looks very optimistic and I'd say ripe for downgrade, and that's echoed by the consensus of independent forecasters. And I think the Bank of England has actually downgraded its productivity forecast to 0.6 or 0.7%. So that's going to have an immediate fiscal impact this autumn, is it not?
The Bank of England's forecast of productivity, long-term productivity growth, is 1%.
Long term, yes.
Yeah, and that's what sort of drives the models, really. But the OBR is higher than that. The number I gave you earlier was just slightly wrong. So the IMF analysis suggests AI could boost UK cumulative total factor productivity over the next 5 years by 1.4%. And so I guess that's the point that sort of Steve Farrington is making, that there have been a series of shocks over the last few years, whether it's the sort of global financial crisis, COVID, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, that have all had a negative effect on productivity and growth. But actually, if you look at some of the underlying drivers of productivity, there is perhaps a reason to be more optimistic in the future if we can contain some of those shocks, in part by building a more resilient economy, and that's what we're trying to do with clean energy, homegrown energy, for example. But some of those underlying factors about the increasing use of technology might give us a bit more cause for optimism.
Picture the scene. A committee room lined with dark wood panels, faces set in stern concentration. Rachel Reeves, Chancellor, sits before them, papers in hand, gaze steady, but with the unease of someone who knows the questions will cut deep. Across the table, MPs prepare, their queries sharpened and ready. The interrogation begins. Chancellor, one asks, with a calculated smirk, "What is your diagnosis of the UK economy?" What follows is revealing. Reeves stalls, stammers, and leans on repetition. The UK economy is 3 attempts at the same sentence before she reaches refuge in a familiar refrain. Productivity. She invokes it again and again, almost as though repetition might substitute for clarity. She speaks of investment, capital, technology, phrases tossed into the air like fragments of a speech that never quite forms a plan. Britain, she insists, lags in private investment among the G7. Her rules, she claims, are different. Different, yes, but in what way? That remained unanswered. The committee presses further. You've mentioned productivity repeatedly. Chancellor, but how precisely will you address it? Reeves turns again to familiar ground. apprenticeships, education, artificial intelligence. It is a litany we've heard before. She suggests technology will propel Britain forward, AI as the catalyst for transformation. But the MPs are unconvinced. They want timelines, specifics. Instead, Reeves offers what politicians often do: promises deferred to the future. When challenged with hard statistics, productivity down 0.2% this quarter. Britain still trailing France and Germany, Reeves nods, agrees with the diagnosis, yet circles back to the same prescriptions: private investment, training, technology. At moments, it feels less like a strategy and more like a loop. And then, in a curious turn, she defers to an official Steve from the Treasury to bolster her case. Steve speaks of long-term trends, planning reforms, the IMF, but the MPs want answers for the months ahead, not the distant horizon. This exchange was more than routine scrutiny. It was a study in political performance. Reeves' rhetoric circled, her answers layered with familiar buzzwords but light on detail. She leaned on optimism, invoked the promise of technology, and when cornered, deferred responsibility. And yet, within the stumbles and the evasions, there lies a truth about politics. Itself, often when pressed, ministers do not have concrete answers. They rely on repetition, on the promise of better days ahead, on the hope that the questions exhaust themselves before the scrutiny cuts too deep. What did we learn? That productivity has become a mantra. That private investment is presented as a cure-all, though the source remains vague. That AI has been elevated to near-mythic status, a deus ex machina for economic woes. And that when all else fails, there is always someone else in the Treasury to call upon. This was not merely a grilling, it was a display of the precariousness of political narrative. Words repeated until they lose meaning, promises stretched into the indefinite future, and the persistent gap between diagnosis and remedy. For the public watching, the message was clear. Britain's economic debate is no closer to resolution. The questions grow sharper, the answers less convincing, and the stakes no less urgent.